Greetings and welcome back to another Perspectives. As I'm recording this, it is Sunday the 29th of January, and if I'm lucky I will get this video out maybe even later today. What I wanted to say is that I looked back at some of my essays and I realized that on this very day, January the 29th of 2022 of last year, I released an essay called Revelation or Fear, the Split Reality. I think that's more or less the title. Revelation or Fear, the Split Reality. And I'll put that in the notes below the link, and it will also be a later video essay. And in that, of course, I talked about how we have these scenarios of Armageddon and apocalypse, and often the media gives us these Armageddon future scenarios, these kind of dystopian memes, which I think I'll also talk about in another Perspectives video. And of course, the apocalypse, as distinct from Armageddon, is Armageddon refers to, as I've talked about, this location, which is the location of a battle at the end times, a place which is now located in Israel. Whereas apocalypse comes from the Greek apocalyptica, which means a revelation, a revealing. And I kind of looked at how we have this different perceptual pathways. We can buy into this apocalyptic, this very physical, this very three-dimensional kind of reality narrative, whereby everything is breaking down and we go into, well, we could go into a nuclear war, we could go into socio-cultural collapse and in a type of Armageddon pathway. Whereas apocalypse is a revelation. And just the other day I did a talk with Quartet, and the theme was plot twists. And plot twists suggesting and that what type of events are we not expecting that could change the plot, change the story. And what I brought forth, my contribution, was that we could see some implosions. And what I mean by implosions is that in terms of these top elite groups, the cabal, however we want to call them, we could see some infighting amongst themselves at the very top, and some defections. And as these different factions in these elite groups start fighting, people defect, and then you have top level whistleblowers who will start to tell about what's really happening in these elite groups, what their agenda really is, what they're really doing. And this is not impossible. We may have some people say, no, the line has been crossed. I just can't go any further, and I don't agree with these power plays, because when you're in a group of power, everybody is greedy. When everybody's greedy, you can't trust anybody. So there's bound to be infighting, and we could get some revelations coming from that. Another thing I mentioned was that we could have some revelations from the pharmaceutical industry concerning vax injuries, and therefore you have some whistleblowers in the pharmaceutical industry, and then this will reveal some of the dubious practices, and from that the public will start to realize that vax injuries have been validated, which will then start some legal battles. You'll have some government implosion and resignations, because the governments which supported the medical establishment there will be collateral damage from this fallout. So I mentioned that, and of course that happened at the same time we recorded previously. This happened at the same time as we now have this revelation that there's a certain pharmaceutical company which is mutating a particular virus so that it can make more vaccines for that. And so this is coming out. Later on in February, we're having some demonstrations in the UK against the media. And one of the slogans is BBC is the virus. And of course, in America, they're having a simultaneous protest in New York in February, sometime in February, and their slogan is media is the virus. So they're having people revealing that these institutions are not trustworthy. So I mean, and then of course I also mentioned that we could have some implosions in certain regimes, one of them being Ukraine. And then as you have also just this very week, by coincidence, some top-level politicians in the Ukraine regime have resigned because of corruption issues. So there could be further corruption issues, and then people realize that, the regime is a proxy regime being, which was set up and being held up by the West. And when this starts to come out again, everything falls, it implodes. See, what's happening here is that this was a scenario that was put as plot twists, unusual happenings. But at the same time, I don't think they're so unusual because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the year, I feel we are going through some proceeds of revealing. And, they always say that, it always gets darkest before the dawn. We've had a consensus reality, which has been exactly that, consensus. We all have to support it. We all have to sustain it, which means we all have to buy into it. And this is like just a virtual reality, simulation or simulacra, whereby it's just we're buying into this game narrative. And we've been living, and many people have been living on this sense of trust. We trust our institutions, we trust certain governance systems, we trust these infrastructure that's been in position of maintaining our socio-cultural establishment. But a lot of things have been happening. A lot of revelations have been coming that aren't so obvious. For example, more and more people, it seems, are taking their children out of the schools and education and into homeschooling, because they're realizing not only how terrible is educational system, but how it's conditioning the children. And more people have been thinking about changing their food habits, because they see these news about insects and bugs being put into the food chain, and also they've realized how crappy the modern food supply chain is. And more people are growing their vegetables and starting to try out their little gardens. Some people have been thinking about going off grid and moving more into a natural environment. So these things have been happening. These are all in their way kind of mini revelations. They're revelations because it's beginning to dawn on many people that we've been hoodwinked for so long. We've been told a set of stories which are now crumbling. And once this starts to happen, it's very easy to gain momentum. And this is when the consensus reality collapses. And I've talked about this for a couple of years. For those of you who are aware of my work, in 2020, in January 2020, or rather December 2019, I predicted that the year ahead would be consensus reality meltdown. Consensus reality meltdown is a process which falls into the notion of revelation, because as the consensus reality starts to collapse, things are revealed to us. And I think this is happening now, as I said, it doesn't have to be on a macro scale. We don't have to have the President of America coming out and said, look, yes, I admit it. It all is a lie and all a sham. Even though we know it is, we don't need a top person to admit it quite yet, because we're having micro revelations. And we're having our own personal aha moments as well. We're realizing that we need to, look after our own health in much more organic, homemade ways. I'm sure there's more people looking into how they can preserve their food, their home cooked food more, how they can pickle food, how they can store food. All these things are happening. It's rippling through, which means that at the bottom level, people are losing trust and faith in the managed world around them, or how they've been told. And I do feel that this is going to increase. And although it may be uncomfortable for some to realize that investments in certain beliefs and trust have been betrayed, but that recognition of betrayal is necessary in order to take away your allegiances energetically, perception-wise, emotional-wise, even practical-wise. We may depend on certain structures that we have to realign our dependencies. We have to realign our resources. So, along with the revelation, the waking up that happens on all these micro levels, comes a realignment. But realignments have to come into play as incumbent systems break down and fall down. These realignments are necessary. It's when realignments come on a really, really big shock level, such as a civilizational collapse, that it gets very traumatic and very damaging, and not everyone can push through. But if people start making their micro realignments, then of course it's a much smoother transition away. And I'm probably, it's very likely that whoever takes the time to listen to me, and bless you for that, are already into this understanding and perception that these micro realignments are taking place, and no doubt probably have taken place many years ago in our individual lives. So what we're talking about is not such a great, big shock after all. So while there's a lot of mainstream news, which is obviously always fear-mongering, talking about the potential nuclear conflict and the economic collapse thanks to these Ponzi schemes, like the cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme that FXI, that was brought down like the Twin Towers, a kind of orchestrated collapse. Then we realize that actually the reality model that we've been presented with is likewise an artificial construct, which is going through also a kind of orchestrated, manipulated demolition. And if you are in those towers, in those realities, as a demolition brings them down, it's quite painful. But if you're not in that reality set, then you can see the smoke and the dust as these deliberate implosions happen. But having our prior revelations is supportive of where we are. So despite all these fear-mongering, I do feel that we are going to see a lot more revelatory insights coming out, which is natural. As I said, when civilization starts to implode, these revelations come out. Some of them will be accidental, some of them may be by whistleblowers or information coming out at an opportune time. But I just wanted to add on this day where I'm reminded of what I said, what I published on this day last year. We can have revelation or we can have fear. I've been seeing a lot more signs of these revelations coming out, and that's the path to notice, not the fear one. So I hope I'll try and get this out today on 29th of January to mark the anniversary of the apocalyptic revelations. Okay, thanks for checking in. Speak to you soon. Cheers.